While Calgary has made real strides with regards to transportation options, including advancements to our public transit and the cycle track network, there's no getting around the fact that with a footprint of 825 square kilometers, Calgary is a car-centric city. Many communities in our city have dismal walkability scores, and it's clear that the car was king when these areas were designed and built. With this in mind, coupled with heavy traffic in our urban center, 400 to 500 pedestrians are hit by cars each year. This has prompted Step Forward, a pedestrian strategy set to go before a city committee in the near future that recommends reducing the speed limit to 40 kilometers an hour in residential areas, installing more flashing light pedestrian crosswalks, as well as other measures aimed at curbing pedestrian collisions. Opponents of the strategy say enforcement of current laws is what will save lives, and that stressing pedestrian personal responsibility is a better solution. Hey Calgary, I'm Kevin Chorney. This is Calgary Now. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm here tonight joined by Ward 12 City Councillor Shane Keating, as well as Jody Morell from Slow Down YYC. Both of you, thanks very much for being here.
Thank you.
Welcome back, Shane. It's good to see you again. Jody, maybe I'll start with you. Tell me a bit about the mandate right now at Slow Down YYC, and of course, a bit about yourself.
I started Slow Down YYC after a fatality in my community because at that time I wasn't aware that the residential speed was actually 50 kilometers per hour unless otherwise marked. And so when the fatality occurred, the injuries were excessive. And so that's when I started doing some research to see if what I had experienced was indicative of what actually happens at 50K or what we allow over. And it is. And so I determined that this wasn't appropriate. I have a young son, I walk in the community, and if we want mobility in our community, if we want people to be out there engaging and walking and biking, and we have to have a level of security and a level of safety, and I don't think that the 50 kilometers provides that.
Have the needs of pedestrians more or less been overlooked, kind of flown under the radar in Calgary? And I'm talking about, I see bus stops, for example, on the side of maybe a grass hill with just 4 to 8 feet of concrete, and a bus stop is erected there. So there's clearly no sidewalk. I wonder about lighting. You know, I see a lot of streets that are obviously pretty dim. I mean, have we done enough from the get-go to really plan for pedestrian traffic?
I think you have to look at each area specifically and actually see what the amount of pedestrians and the traffic. We could always do more, there's no doubt about it. But if you have an area where we provide transit, and it's a very low use area, can you go through that expense of making sure it's exactly the same as what you would have in the core? You always have to balance the expenses and where it is and what it's doing. We're looking at a number of things on main streets, of putting sidewalks on both sides of the street and making them wide enough for 2 wheelchairs can go by at the same time. So that's the change. The other issue is you have to look at the developments that have happened 50, 60 years ago and how you retrofit those to a new articulated bus. Obviously wasn't around then.
That's right.
So you have to balance what you can do, where you can do it, and what is the best for the amount of traffic you have.
Calgary's got some adverse weather conditions. We've got some poor street designs, I think, as you touched on. A lot of cars on the road, more cars on the road per capita than a lot of other Canadian cities. I mean, by default, do we think that Calgary drivers are just taxed a little bit more than other cities?
I don't think so. I think Toronto has a greater issue than we do. They're much bigger, and they've, I guess, taken our model, or we've taken their model, however you want to look at it, and built for cars instead of people. And they have fatalities, I think, almost daily. It's a real problem for them. And I think Calgary, the size that it is now, with what we know, the technology that's available, we have the ability to actually save in the future by implementing now. And New York is another city that said enough is enough because the density and the amount of fatalities just made it no longer acceptable.
So has New York adopted a lower speed limit in a lot of the residential areas?
Yeah, they have actually gone with the Vision Zero. They're one of the early adopters of Vision Zero in the US, although there's quite a few cities, I believe Boston, Seattle, Washington, DC. They've adopted Vision Zero, which is the goal to reduce fatalities to 0 in a set period of time. And the foundational element of that is lower speed, because design and everything else is working towards that, but it's a longer term, more costly endeavor. So what they did in New York is they lowered speeds right away, and then they kicked up enforcement. And then from there, they've got this longer term plan to make the streets more pedestrian friendly. But that was their first step.
I like those words. I like kicked up enforcement. I think that's should be a bigger part of the conversation. Shane, are you familiar with the Step Forward program, the pedestrian strategy that's been kicking around a little bit? I know it hasn't really come out officially in front of council yet, but I'm sure you've heard some rumblings.
Well, it's come to committee,
Yeah.
and we've looked at where it is, and yeah, it has 50 actions, and that's part of the difficulty we had at the time was when you do a broad base and you bring in 50 items to work, many of those could be done without question and do them right, and there actually are doing a number of them. There were 5 or 6 of them, that needed to say, let's go back to the public. There was no engagement as saying, is this what you really want? Yeah. Say, for example, it recommended go to 40K across the city. Is that right, or should it be 30? We didn't ask those questions. It came back and just said, here's what we think you should do. And so we sent it back for a few extra months to come back with a recommendation of talking to the councillors, talking to the public, and saying, where are we going to go with this and in what direction specifically? The enforcement is crucial. They studied a number of municipalities that lowered the speed limit, no enforcement, and the traffic times or the limits dropped by 2 or 3 kilometers.
So really no difference?
No difference whatsoever. And if they're speeding then, they're so the enforcement is crucial, and we've been after getting a dedicated residential enforcement force out into the, going around the residents on a rotating basis. Mm-hmm. They also looked at municipalities where they upped the enforcement and dropped the speed limit, and they reduced collisions by 25%.
25%?
25, sorry.
Wow.
That's what we're looking for, is stuff like that, but you have to do them both together.
Wrote a lot of tickets, I'm sure.
Well, and I mean, that's the mentality
that's the
we
point,
have
though.
To some degree. That's the point.
Yeah.
In a residential area, and I can look at some areas in my ward, no front garages, so all the garages are in the lanes.
Yeah.
So you have cars parked on both sides, narrow streets,
Yeah.
and if someone speeds, and the other issue is an individual talked about the perceived mentality that you can speed 10 kilometers over the limit and get away with it, which I think has been over time and is explained to me. It came in really because the old radar wasn't as precise as it should have been. So if they went 10 kilometers over, they knew you were speeding. So now, but the new technology is very precise, and they came forward and an individual said, why don't we have a 10% leniency? If it's at a 30 kilometer zone, you get a ticket at 34 kilometers, because there's a big difference of 10 kilometers over at 30 than 10 kilometers over at 100.
80 or 6, sure.
And so there should be, say, a 10% lenience. You're at 50 and you're going 56, you're getting a ticket. That's the mentality we have to change.
Interesting, yeah. That's sensible. Folks, we're going to jump to our rant pack and check in. Stay with us.
I'd probably be shocked to know how many bylaws are actually on the books in Calgary. It's ones that kind of hit particularly hard with me is the one where with scraping of driveways and the amount of warning that you're given to clear them after a snowfall. The speeding in rural areas, I think it is a problem. On my street, it definitely is. I live in an old neighborhood with very narrow streets, and I mean, I would say that some people are flying by my house going 60 kilometers an hour. And this isn't even a primary street, this is a secondary back area street. I think we don't necessarily need to add more bylaws, but I think we need to start holding people more accountable. If you schmuck somebody on a back road street and you're going faster than 30, 40 kilometers an hour, there's repercussions. But and I mean, that goes for pedestrians as well. They need to be responsible for themselves, look both ways before you cross the street. I don't think it's a difficult concept to grasp.
Okay, Jody, so what is the science then behind the 40 kilometers an hour? Why is that the kind of magic number?
Well, 40 isn't actually, 30 is. The public
tough sell for 30, right?
The numbers basically indicate that at 30 kilometers an hour, the survivability is over 85%, I believe. So you have a really good chance of walking away from that situation. When you get up to 40 kilometers an hour, you're getting closer to a 35 to 40% chance of fatality. You get to the 50-55, now you're over a 50% chance of fatality, and injury is almost certain. So really 30K is what it has been proposed in a lot of places overseas, Netherlands. Dr. Bert Lauwers was the chief coroner of Ontario. In 2010, he had actually proposed that the province move to 40 kilometers an hour. And
Province-wide?
Province-wide.
Wow.
And that the municipalities have the ability to lower further in residential areas to 30 kilometers an hour. And he used that based on the science of being the chief coroner of Ontario.
He's the guy then?
He's the guy.
Okay.
So you start there and you chip away and you find out that the data is irrefutable. No matter how you look at it, it's physics, and 30 is the safest speed. And from there, it's a bit of a compromise to go with 40.
Okay, so I think political will-wise, it'd be pretty tough to get 30 on the board. 40 seems like, like you said, a bit of a compromise. What else is going to be employed? What else do you think we need to protect people? Sure, the speed limit's one thing, yet to be seen if that's going to happen. I think about more flashing crosswalks, just again as part of this step forward pedestrian strategy. I don't see a whole lot of those in the city. We could probably use a few more of those. We're talking about speed bumps. Are these things that obviously they are going to protect pedestrians, but we're talking, the plan I think calls for $15 million with capital expenditure followed by an operating budget of about $2.5 million a year. Are Calgary citizens, do you think, Shane, going to get on board with that kind of money for this?
Well, you have to separate the actual costs within that 15, because some of that 15 was shoveling more snow at bus stops. And that's not going to do much.
That's not fair, yeah, that's a good point.
But it does help those who are physically, disabled and these sorts of things to get on the buses and all. So that's the balance between what we're talking about, whether it's just pedestrian safety or is it pedestrian ease as well. And you look at both of those. But we've had the issue of the large overhead pedestrian lights, which are $90,000, $100,000 to install.
Yeah.
We've been piloting and we're pushing forward, and we're actually going more with the solar-powered rapid flashing rectangular beacons, which are $20,000 to $40,000.
You can't miss those.
You can't miss them. They're bright, they're there, they're LED, they're solar powered, they're cheaper to install.
Yeah.
So we're pushing those out more and more, and that's part of the strategy as well of saying, okay, you may need the big overhead ones at really, really busy spots, but you don't need those everywhere.
No.
So let's put more of these, and you push the button and the little LED, bright light flashes. But again, you need drivers who are going to adhere to them, and you need pedestrians who aren't going to assume that if they're on, everything's good. Yeah. We've got to have that balance again between the drivers and the pedestrians.
Yeah, the shared responsibility aspect. Have people sort of, I guess, fallen into a comfort zone on Calgary streets? I mean, I shouldn't say comfort. 400 to 500 pedestrians are hit by cars in Calgary every year. We see about 8 fatalities. Are people not as attentive nowadays as they need to be? I mean, we've got a lot of distractions in life, be it cell phones, headphones. Just your comments on that, or is that way off left field?
There are definitely more distractions. Busier streets lead to more distractions. You have to consider we have technology now. We've had many years now of having cars and building roads wrong and thinking about how to make cars go faster, and we hadn't really thought about the things that we were putting in place, how safe they were for people. For instance, those big flashing lights. Yeah. I don't know how many times I personally have come up to them and not seen the light, or I look up at the light and I don't see the pedestrian. So you have a disconnect between where the eyes are and where the indicator is. We know now that we need to be down here, right? And same with turning right on a red light, or not having an advanced crossing for pedestrians. So when the light changes, pedestrian steps out, car's trying to complete its turn. There's a lot of things that we've created that was meant to make cars move faster through the city, but really was a problem for pedestrians. So I think we have to claw back a bit and say, what can we do to make it more equal? So the responsibility should be equal, but it should be easier. It should be easier for the driver to see the pedestrian, to respond, because I'm certain that they don't intend to hurt anyone.
I would hope not.
No, and it should be easier for the pedestrian to feel more comfortable on the street, knowing that where they're crossing is the best place to cross, and they've done everything they can to protect themselves.
Folks, we're going to jump to a rant pack. Stay with us.
The Silly bylaws in town. Okay, first of all, tobogganing, we've been doing that for years and years and years. Those of us that were born in the 50s and 60s, hey, we're still here. We all tobogganed with no helmets. We're fine. And we also skated with no helmets. It's cool. People shouldn't bubble wrap their kids too much. As it relates to speed limits, though, there's numerous studies that show that lowering speed limits actually causes great driver frustration and actually increases accidents. BC has done some very significant studies, and in fact they have raised the limits on several of their roadways, one being the Coquihalla Highway, which was raised from 110 to 120. The naysayers suggested that that would cause many, many more accidents, and in fact it has greatly reduced accidents because 120 is the speed that most people were driving. Where this relates to residential areas, it doesn't matter what the speed limit is. People will drive for road conditions in residential areas. And the only caveat I will say about that is, yes, there should be posted signs, posted speed limits in school zones and playground zones. Although playground zones till 10 o'clock at night are dumb because kids who use playgrounds should be in bed by 8 o'clock. There you go.